We look at old steam engines and see beautiful, chugging pieces of history. We are wrong. A steam locomotive is a high-pressure bomb on wheels. To pull thousands of tons over the American mountains, engineers trapped boiling water inside a steel jacket and squeezed it until it reached terrifying pressures. But what happens when 300 pounds per square inch snapped the steel, creating the 10 deadliest boiler detonations? When the metal finally broke, these 300-ton leviathans did not just break down, they detonated. Boilers weighing 16,000 pounds were ripped from their frames and fired a quarter-mile into the sky like ballistic missiles. Solid steel turned to shrapnel, and whole railyards were erased in a single second. But the scariest part was not the explosions themselves. It was why they happened. It was not enemy fire. It was a microscopic, invisible failure happening right beneath the engineer's feet. How does a half-inch sheet of steel bring down the biggest machines on Earth? And what happens when the men in the roundhouse push American horsepower past the breaking point? A locomotive boiler at 300 pounds per square inch is not a relic. It is a pressure vessel under constant siege. Every square inch of its steel shell holds back the force of 300 atmospheric columns, each one pressing like the weight of a sledgehammer. Inside, water is trapped at 417 degrees Fahrenheit, far above its natural boiling point, waiting for the smallest breach to unleash its potential. At this pressure, the water is not just hot, it is superheated, holding 189 BTU of enthalpy for every pound. The difference between liquid and vapor is not a gentle simmer, but a hard line. Cross it, and the energy release is immediate and violent. Steam tables confirm the numbers. At 300 pounds per square inch, a pound of water occupies just 0.017 cubic feet. Flash it to atmospheric pressure and it tries to occupy over 3.8 cubic feet as vapor, a 222-fold jump in volume. The popular claim of 1,600 times expansion is a low-pressure myth. In the reality of a locomotive boiler, the true figure is closer to 200 or 250 times. Still, that expansion is not gradual. It is a kinetic event, measured in milliseconds. The moment containment fails, the water flashes, hurling steel and superheated vapor outward with explosive force. A full boiler, 25,000 gallons, 200,000 pounds of water, stores nearly 40 billion joules of energy. That is the equivalent of 10 tons of TNT, held in check by nothing more than a half-inch of steel and the discipline of the crew. Every time the fireman shovels coal, every time the engineer opens the throttle, they are feeding a system that is always on the verge of kinetic release. In this world, pressure is not a number on a gauge. It is the loaded chamber of a weapon, cocked and waiting for the smallest failure. Steel in a locomotive boiler is not a passive barrier. It is a threshold, and heat is the key. At room temperature, boilerplate steel holds a tensile strength of 55,000 pounds per square inch. That number is not a suggestion. It is the difference between containment and detonation. But introduce fire. The furnace gases beneath the crown sheet reach 2,200 degrees Fahrenheit. The only defense is a thin layer of water holding the steel at the boiling point, 417 degrees Fahrenheit at 300 pounds per square inch. Remove that water and the crown sheet is exposed. Within seconds, the temperature at the steel rises above 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit. By 1,200 degrees Fahrenheit, the steel's strength is cut in half. The ASME curves are clear. What could once withstand 55,000 pounds per square inch now yields at 25,000 pounds per square inch, then 20,000 pounds per square inch. Above 1,200 degrees Fahrenheit, the steel turns plastic. It stretches. It bags. The pressure inside the boiler does not drop to meet the steel. The steel drops to meet the pressure. At this point, the 300 pounds per square inch inside the vessel is no longer held at bay by a fortress. It is pressing against a membrane. The margin for error is gone. One metallurgist put it this way: at 1,200 degrees Fahrenheit, steel does not fail gradually. It surrenders. This is why boiler failures are not slow leaks or cracks. They are instantaneous, violent, and total. The moment the steel crosses the plastic transition, the pressure finishes the job. Containment breach is not a question of if, but when. The laws of thermodynamics do not negotiate. They only wait for the weakest link. Water is the shield and the saboteur. In the closed system of a locomotive boiler, its behavior is never neutral. On a steep grade, tonnage drags the engine uphill, and the waterline tilts. Gravity pulls the liquid forward, uncovering the rear edge of the crown sheet in seconds. That half-inch of steel, no longer cooled by water, absorbs the full heat of the firebox, over 2,000 degrees. Within half a minute, the steel softens, losing more than half its strength. At 1,200 degrees Fahrenheit, it surrenders, and the pressure inside finds the new weak point. Foaming, the second betrayal, is quieter but just as lethal. Hard water, rich in dissolved minerals, boils into a rolling mass of bubbles. The sight glass reads high, but the true waterline drops. The crew sees safety where none exists. As the foam carries over, the crown sheet is left exposed. In less than a minute, the steel is red hot, and the stay bolts begin to stretch. The next injector blast or throttle pull sends a wave, water hammer, slamming through the boiler. Pressure spikes, transient but deadly, test every seam and bolt. Stay bolts snap, and the membrane gives way. 3 detonations in the top 10 start this way. Each begins with a simple shift, water sloshing, foam rising, a shockwave passing through. The result is always the same: the shield drops, the steel yields, and the kinetic shockwave writes the final report. A locomotive boiler is only as strong as its weakest moving part. Feed water starvation is the silent killer, an insidious sequence that begins not with a dramatic rupture, but with a trickle reduced to nothing. The injector, a device the size of a coffee mug, is all that stands between full pressure and catastrophic exposure. When it fails, by scale, by worn check valves, by a single pinhole of calcium, the flow can drop by 70% or more in minutes. With the firebox roaring at 2,000 degrees, water stops reaching the boiler. The crown sheet, still under 300 PSI, is left uncooled. Calcite deposits, invisible until too late, choke the half-inch brass feeder pipes. What should be a clear passage for makeup water becomes a stone-cold plug. The sight glass may still read safe, but the boiler is running dry. The engineer pulls the lever and hears only a hiss. The injector, fouled by a decade of hard water, cannot overcome the pressure. Inside, the waterline drops below the crown. Steel that once shrugged off 55,000 PS now loses its will at 1,200 degrees. The margin is gone. No alarm sounds. The only warning is a rising tick in the firebox, a subtle shift in the color of the flame. By the time the crew notices, the weakest link has already failed. A scale plug, a failed injector, a forgotten filter, each one a microscopic betrayal. In the world of high-pressure steam, the smallest oversight writes the largest headline. Stay bolts are the silent sentinels of a boiler, hundreds of threaded steel rods, each spaced 4 to 6 inches apart, anchoring the crown sheet to the shell. Their job is simple: resist the pressure trying to turn the firebox into shrapnel. But every pressure cycle, every thermal swing, pushes these bolts closer to their fatigue threshold. Over time, microscopic cracks form at the threads, invisible to the naked eye. Inspectors tap each bolt with a hammer, listening for a dead ring that betrays a fracture, but not every failure sings before it snaps. When the crown sheet overheats, the steel around the stays softens, and the once rigid grid begins to sag. The load concentrates on a handful of survivors. One by one, they shear off, leaving the plate unsupported. Superheater elements, exposed to the hottest gases, face a different enemy: embrittlement. At sustained high temperatures, steel loses its ductility. Oxygen and sulfur in the firebox atmosphere attack the grain boundaries, turning tough metal brittle. A stay bolt, or tube that might bend under pressure, now fractures cleanly. The margin for error shrinks with every degree above design specification. When enough stays fail, the crown sheet is no longer a barrier, it is a trapdoor. The water above, superheated and waiting, finds the path of least resistance. The result is not a slow leak, but a structural collapse that delivers all the stored energy in a single kinetic event. This is the tipping point, the moment fatigue and heat cross the threshold from manageable risk to catastrophic failure. Steel, in theory, is the fortress wall, but metallurgy is not theory, it is a game of atomic dice. A locomotive boilerplate rolled in 1943 might look flawless to the naked eye, but under the microscope, the story changes. Embedded in the grain, a manganese sulfide inclusion the size of a pencil tip becomes the future epicenter of disaster. Every pressure cycle, hundreds per hour and thousands per shift, works that invisible flaw, driving microcracks deeper along the boundary. Each firing, each throttle pull, flexes the lattice until the crack propagates far enough to threaten the vessel's integrity. A senior metallurgist holding a fractured segment under a scanning electron microscope points to the origin and says this is where it started. A 10-micron inclusion rolled into the plate at the mill. The rest is just stress doing what stress does. The fracture face shows classic river patterns, evidence of a brittle, inclusion-initiated rupture, not a ductile overload. Grain boundaries, once the steel's strongest defense, become highways for failure under repeated load. Inclusion-initiated cracks are rare, but when they go without warning. No gauge reads high, no glass shows low. The boiler runs perfectly until it does not. The flaw, invisible for years, becomes the only point that matters. When the pressure finally finds it, the result is not a gradual leak, but a sudden, catastrophic breach. The boiler, once a model of reliability, becomes a kinetic weapon in the blink of an eye. Perfect operation cannot outrun bad metal. At 300 pounds per square inch, the laws of fracture mechanics write the last line. A locomotive the size of the Allegheny is not just a machine. It is 600 tons of rolling steel, a mobile fortress built to haul mountains. But even a fortress can be brought down by the smallest oversight. In the Allegheny case, maintenance records show the watertight glass was neglected for weeks. Calcium from hard water built up inside the glass, forming a white film that narrowed the passage to a pinhole. With each firing cycle, more scale layered the glass, clouding the operator's only window into the boiler's true condition. When the crew checked the indicator, it read safe, water level steady, no cause for alarm. In reality, the glass was lying. The true waterline had dropped below the crown sheet, but the scale plug held a column of water in the tube, faking a normal reading. The engineer, trusting the instrument, kept the fire hot and the throttle wide. Behind the glass, the firebox raged at 2,200 degrees, and the uncooled crown sheet began to absorb the full blast. Steel that should have been protected by water was now taking heat direct from the furnace. Within 60 seconds, the temperature at the crown sheet soared past 1,000 degrees. Tensile strength fell away. The stay bolts, designed to anchor the firebox against 300 pounds per square inch, met metal that had turned soft and plastic. Investigators later scraped the glass and found a crust of calcium thick enough to block half the bore. One inspector described it as a stone plug, not a sight glass. The root cause was not a broken part, but routine cleaning skipped in the name of schedule. In an engine where every pound of pressure is a loaded weapon, that omission handed control back to the laws of chemistry. The result was a false level, a silent countdown, and a 600-ton locomotive pushed past its threshold by nothing more than a dirty indicator. At 8:55 a.m. on March 18, 1912, Southern Pacific Locomotive number 704 became a test case in the mechanics of disaster. The boiler, rated for 300 pounds per square inch, was not defeated by sabotage or a hidden flaw in the steel. It was weaponized by a single act of negligence. A replacement mechanic, unfamiliar with the fine tolerances of a safety valve screw, tightened it past the point of relief. The cotter pin meant to lock the adjustment was missing. The valve, designed to vent excess pressure, was now a dead end. With the gauge broken and the original crew on strike, the boiler entered a closed loop of rising pressure, unchecked by any human or mechanical safeguard. Inside, the water reached 417 degrees Fahrenheit, storing over 189 BTU per pound. The firebox, still roaring at over 2,000 degrees, fed the pressure relentlessly. The steel shell, half an inch thick, held back a force equal to 300 times atmospheric pressure on every square inch. The safety margin, already thin, vanished the moment the valve seized. The containment breach was total. Flash vaporization converted liquid to steam in less than 1/10 of a second. The stored energy, nearly 40 billion joules, found the path of least resistance. A 16,000-pound section of the boiler shell sheared free, hurled over 1,200 feet, 4 football fields, before coming to rest. The head plate, 1,200 pounds of iron, was thrown in the opposite direction. Buildings within a 100-foot radius were flattened. The kinetic shockwave ignited an oil fire, trapping workers and compounding the toll. At least 26 were killed, many never identified. The Interstate Commerce Commission timeline reads like a courtroom indictment. The evidence is mechanical: a jammed safety valve, a torque-marked screw, a missing cotter pin, a broken gauge. There was no sabotage, there was no mystery. The pressure had nowhere to go, so it went through steel. In the aftermath, fragments of the boiler were mapped across the rail yard, each trajectory a ballistic record of the energy released. The lesson is not in the violence, but in the sequence. One screw, over-tightened, turned a pressure vessel into a missile. The laws of thermodynamics require respect. On March 18, 1912, respect was the missing part. June 16, 1995, Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. The number on the cab is 1,278, but the physics in the firebox are the same as they were in 1912, 1953, or any year a locomotive rolled out of the shops. On that day, a preserved Canadian Pacific 462, running a tourist excursion, suffered a containment breach rooted not in sabotage or rumors of sabotage, but in the ancient, unyielding logic of thermodynamics. The crew, operating under the assumption that routine was safety, failed to maintain the water level above the crown sheet. A clogged sight glass, left fouled by months of mineral buildup, told the fireman what he wanted to see. The true waterline was dropping. Inside the boiler, 300 pounds per square inch pressed against steel that was losing its will to resist. The firebox roared at over 2,000 degrees, and the only shield, the inch-thick barrier of water above the crown, was gone. Within a minute, the crown sheet temperature shot past 1,000 degrees. Tensile strength fell away. The stay bolts, meant to anchor the crown to the shell, began to pull through red-hot steel. The moment the last bolt surrendered, the pressure inside the boiler found its exit. Flash vaporization did the rest. Superheated water, now in contact with the firebox atmosphere, expanded at over 200 times its liquid volume. The result was a kinetic shockwave that tore the front crown sheet downward, bulging it a full foot over 60 stays and ripping a 6-inch gash near the tube sheet. The Federal Railroad Administration investigation reads like a post-mortem from a century earlier: scale in the sight glass, missed maintenance intervals, a crew unprepared for the old rules. The report's language is blunt. Neglected cleaning routines. The preservation chief did not plead ignorance. He said they thought the modern era meant the physics would give them a break. It didn't. Since 1995, Federal Railroad Administration heritage guidelines have mandated dual water gauges, positive lockouts, and torque-verified safety valve checks for all operating steam locomotives, preserved or otherwise. But the underlying message is not procedural, it is elemental. The laws that govern Southern Pacific No. 704 and C&O Allegheny remain in force. Water is still the shield, steel still surrenders at 1,200 degrees, and 300 pounds per square inch, ignored, will always find the weakest link. Steel, when pushed past its yield point by 300 pounds per square inch and 2,200 degrees of fury, does not negotiate. It fails in milliseconds, turning engineering into ordnance. Even now, any vessel trapping superheated water is a latent kinetic threat. Complacency invites containment breach. The laws of thermodynamics remain absolute, enforced without warning, mercy, or appeal. Respect the pressure, or witness its verdict. Drop your perspective in the comments below.